Welcome to the RCAP USA Roundup, a podcast where we have real conversations affecting both cattle producers and beef consumers. We're your hosts, Jaden Moreland and
Karina Jones.
With that, let's get to today's episode. This episode is sponsored by Hayden Outdoors Real Estate. Hayden Outdoors represents the finest real estate for sale, including farm, ranch, and recreational properties from coast to coast. From legacy ranches to farms for sale, luxury real estate, hunting land, waterfront recreational properties, and more, they can help you buy or sell your next property. Make sure to visit their website, haydenoutdoors.com, and follow along on their Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Thank you, Hayden Outdoors, for being a 2022 convention sponsor, and thank you for your support. The Federal Trade Commission's job is protecting the public from deceptive or unfair business practices and from unfair methods of competition through law enforcement, advocacy, research, and education. Today we visit with one of the 5 commissioners of the FTC, Commissioner Alvaro Bedoya, and talk rural America, agriculture, antitrust, and consumers. Well, welcome to another episode of the RCAP USA Roundup. We are very excited to welcome our guest today, Commissioner Alvaro Bedoya with the Federal Trade Commission. So, Commissioner, let's start with an introduction. Tell our listeners who you are and what your job consists of.
Thank you so much for having me. So I, as you mentioned, I am a commissioner at the Federal Trade Commission. I'm one of 5 commissioners. One of us is the chair, Lena Khan. And so we are the nation's leading enforcement agency to protect consumers and protect competition in the American economy. And so we were founded in 1914 with some antitrust authorities. And over the years, we've come to enforce almost 80 federal laws. But the core of that is antitrust, along with consumer protection in a law called Section 5, which was passed in 1914 and amended in 1938.
Wonderful. So I know it is a busy time in Washington with it being election season, and I'm sure you have a busy office as well. So talk to us about what your day-to-day looks like in this career.
Sure. So as a commissioner, you wear different hats. One of them is that of an adjudicator. So the staff teams will come up with a case, an enforcement action they want to bring, and they present it to the commissioners to say, please could you vote to support this action and move it forward. And in doing that, we often meet with the target of the investigation or the enforcement action. So we hear from them, and then we decide who is whether to move forward with the action. And in that role, we also help set the priorities of the commission, right? As one of the 5 heads of the commission, we are regularly in touch with all the different components of the agency, referring cases, highlighting areas where we want to see more enforcement. So, for example, one thing, we just had a call with one of the shops, and we said, look, anytime you're dealing with food or healthcare in rural or urban America, we want to know about it. And we'd love to know what you're working on in that space. So it has both an adjudicative role where we're deciding what enforcement actions to bring, and kind of a prosecutorial role where we're highlighting cases, we're highlighting priorities for the commission to act on.
Very cool. So let's talk about your career and where you came from and how you ended up being one of the only 5 commissioners on the Federal Trade Commission.
Sure. So this probably started back in 2009. I was 2 years out of law school. I got a job as chief counsel to Senator Franken, Minnesota, and we were charged with standing up a subcommittee on privacy and technology, and so we ran some of the first major oversight hearings into major technology companies like Google, Apple, Facebook, Netflix, et cetera, and among others. And we also ran investigations. And I think what really differentiated these hearings from others is that back then, big tech, to speak generally, was pretty popular. There weren't too many oversight hearings where they were rigorous, where it wasn't a cakewalk, as it were, for the companies. And these hearings, I like to think, stood out because we really questioned the companies and their practices in protecting people's data. And so you might be listening to this and wondering, what the heck does this have to do with me and my work in rural America or in agriculture? And what I tell folks is that this experience taught me to be really skeptical about concentrated market power and how it can be abused in a way that hurts consumers, it hurts the public, and hurts small business. And the shorthand way to say this is I don't like bullies. I don't like when powerful companies misuse their authority and abuse it in a way that creates an unlevel playing field for their competitors or hurts the American public. So that's how I got into government. And so when I was offered the chance to be nominated, at first I couldn't believe it, but of course, I had to take it and had to say yes because of the role that the commission has in protecting people and protecting business.
Wonderful. Well, it sounds like they made a good choice selecting you to be the one of the commissioners. So a lot of ranchers and, rural communities think, Washington, D.C. is up here over their heads, So talk to us about why the FTC is important to people like Karina and I in rural America. Absolutely. And why it is important to American cattle producers.
Absolutely. So while there is a kind of divided set of authorities among enforcement agencies and government agencies for rural America, agriculture in general, and cattle in particular. And so we don't have authority over some key pieces, right? So we don't regulate meatpacking. That was actually stripped away from us in 1921 when we issued a report that they got a little too close to powerful folks. And so we were stripped of that authority. We don't regulate those mergers, but we do, however, we enforce in a lot of the upstream input industries. So, for example, we brought a case that I'm really excited about a month or two ago. We filed it against two pesticide manufacturers who we allege were paying distributors to shut out generics. Right. And so obviously this affects a lot of farmers and we believe affects probably a lot of their products, including, say, the price of grain, which affects cattlemen. And so we do regulate the upstream, we do enforce in those upstream input industries. So that's the first thing. We also enforce and can't have the power to enforce. I think this power has been unused for too long in the retail setting. So we can enforce a law called the Robinson-Patman Act, and we are in our team trying to make the case to start bringing those cases again. We haven't really brought those cases in a long time, but what this law does is make sure that small retailers, small grocers, independent grocers in rural America have the ability to get the same terms for their purchases as manufacturers from big box stores. One of the most eye-opening accounts that we heard in some of our outreach were from grocers like Mr. R.F. Bowie in South Dakota, where he says, "Hey, look, I know I'm small, but I work with a wholesaler, and that wholesaler out of Kansas City is able to bundle the orders of a lot of folks like me in my operation such that we can match the quantities of a lot of the big boxes. And yet, my wholesaler can't get the same prices, even when he can meet quantity, even when he can meet the orders of the big boxes. The price that the big box stores get remains secret. And so that might be an issue under our authority in Robinson-Patman. So we enforce in a lot of the input markets. We enforce at the downstream retail market, can enforce. I think we need to enforce. Lastly, I think something that folks listening should know is we enforce another law called the Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act. And why should people care about that law? What this law says is if you offer a warranty on a product, be it a smartphone or radio or a tractor, if you offer that warranty, you cannot condition the warranty on the purchaser of that product exclusively using your parts and your services. And there's a couple specific exceptions for that. But what some of the cases I've been really excited to vote for are cases where we had settlements, I think, with Harley Davidson, with Weber Grills, where we were making sure that their warranties didn't tie customers into using a particular set of services or a particular set of products that might mean higher prices for those consumers. And so the Chair Khan, is very interested in these right to repair cases. I think in particular because of the promise they have for rural American agriculture in the agricultural sector, which I know is a big deal. And so, yeah, those would be probably the top three, right? The input markets, enforcing in that area, enforcing in the retail sector, and then right to repair through the Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act.
Yes, I know the right to repair stuff is very interesting to our members, and they're very passionate about it because it affects their operations so much. It just brings its own whole set of challenges, expense, etc. Karina, were you about to add something?
I have a question, actually. You reminded us that in 1921, Congress stripped the FTC of oversight of the meatpacking industry.
Right.
Is there anywhere else in the business sector where we have seen Congress strip the FTC of oversight of certain industries, or are we unique?
You are not unique, but you are among just a few. So another area where we were hit on the knuckles of the wrist, where we got some pushback from Congress, was children's advertising on television. So the really funny thing about this is that in the 1980s, the commission did some oversight work, basically with respect to advertising of sugary cereals. That 40 years later, let me say, still pretty unhealthy for folks in general. But the commission was really concerned that this was being marketed directly to children, and was shaping up to bring some enforcement actions and regulatory actions in this case in that space. And so Congress stepped in and actually said you can't issue rules under this particular authority on children's advertising, and set in place a series of other processes we need to follow when we regulate under this particular authority called the Unfair and Deceptive Trade Practices Authority that we got in 1938. But off the top of my head, meatpacking and children's advertising are probably, among only a few where the commission got a little too aggressive in the eyes of some in Congress, and our authority was taken away.
Very interesting.
That's very interesting. So what really instigated this podcast was, from what we understand, you recently gave a presentation that was turned into a fantastic opinion editorial that was sharply focused on this antitrust in the agriculture sector. And so in your first year as a commissioner at the FTC, what has piqued your interest in the antitrust area, and what have you found interesting, I guess, about the history of antitrust in the US?
Yeah, so I'll say a couple things on this. So I was nominated in mid-September in last year, and I think we were on the patio, got a call from the White House, and it's surreal moment. And what's funny is, I was there with my wife, and we celebrated, and calling our family, and very soon after that, the thought occurred to me, oh man, I have to read a lot about antitrust. And so I think that weekend I started ordering antitrust treatises online, and I also started asking my fellow commissioners, what should I be reading here? Because I'd done a little bit of work on antitrust in the Senate along on a major merger in the cable sector, but really it had been limited. And so I was reading, and two things popped out to me from that. The first was, I'd spent, a dozen plus years working on privacy and technology issues. And so I thought I'd be really pulled into that in antitrust. And I was, to a degree, and I still am interested in this intersection of privacy and antitrust. But what really, struck home to me was what was happening with people's groceries or prescriptions and their paychecks. And a lot of that was informed by my wife and the family I have through my wife. So she's from Louisiana, from Kenner, and we, particularly before the pandemic, we spent a lot of time in rural Louisiana. And out there, the grocery store you go to isn't a chain, and the pharmacy you go to usually isn't a chain either. Usually they're independents. And as I read, I read a lot about how it's precisely these independent groceries, independent pharmacies that are shutting down by the thousand because of a lot of what's going on upstream in terms of concentration. They allege, and because of, they say, a lot of the lack of enforcement around laws like Robinson-Patman. And so that really stuck with me, the basics. I also think that it's really good. We have a lot of folks in Washington on the right and the left that are really concerned about big tech. And that's great, and I agree with them. But for me, the heart of antitrust is the basics, is your groceries, your prescriptions, and your paycheck. And that's the other thing I noticed about the history, which is the particular role of agriculture in rural America in the history of antitrust. So when you read these treatises, you just immediately start reading and you hear that the heart of antitrust is efficiency, right? The heart of antitrust is efficient markets and protecting efficiency. And so if you open up one of these treatises, you are hit with XY graphs, about complex curves, about how to distribute surplus across different sectors, and it's almost a math. But when you read the history, which is something I felt really lucky to do, it's a totally different story. So the efficiency arguments are, antitrust protects competition, not competitors. And you don't hear about those competitors. It's this anodyne, very technical reading. You read the history, it's exclusively about competitors. My antitrust advisor, Max Millers from Iowa, he often brags about how the nation's first antitrust statute was passed because small farmers in Iowa, the Granger movement, were pushing for more protections. If you read the debates in the Sherman Act in 1890, Professor Horton talked about this a couple months ago on the show. Not a word is said about efficiency on the floor of the United States Senate and the House of Representatives. Instead, what they talk about are how cattlemen are being cheated out of fair prices for their cattle because of the beef trust, because of a cartel of meat packers. And it's not just 1888, it's not just 1890. There is pretty wide agreement, actually, that 1914, 1936, 1950, every time, 6 times in 5 times in 60 years, when Congress got together to pass antitrust laws, they were focused on leveling the playing field for small business, providing a fair opportunity for small business to compete on the merits, right? No special favors, but just a shot at competing on the merits. And often that was focused on rural America, and within that, agriculture. And so what I learned from the history is that you hear a lot about efficiency, and there's absolutely a place for efficiency, in antitrust enforcement. But is it the lodestar, not when of antitrust? Not when you read the congressional debates, is it? Is it the lodestar when you read the statutes? Again, we are charged by statute with protecting the American public and American business against unfair methods of competition, not inefficient methods of competition. And so that is what the last year has really taught me. And I'm lucky to have the help of not just Max, but also Catherine Sanchez and a big team that helps me make sense of all this. So yeah, that's been the last year for me.
So, as you just walked back through the history of kind of where we came from with antitrust and what the arguments were, Dr. Horton has helped educate our listeners about the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act and what was going on in American history at that time, especially in rural America, and how America used to be the gold standard for antitrust enforcement. I mean, the rest of the world was looking at us at that period of time.
Right.
How did we get here today? Why are, the Sherman Act, the Clayton Act, why aren't these laws being enforced?
So I learned a lot about this as well, and there's a public story, and a lot of aspects of it are true. And I will say that having being at the commission for 6 months, aspects of that public story are true, but there's also aspects that are a little complicated. And so top line, starting in the 1970s and 80s, there was a reaction among certain academics and certain economists that who argued that antitrust enforcement had become too impressionistic and uncertain. And in fairness to them, there was a lot less math and a lot less measuring in antitrust back then than we have today. But they, not just Judge Bork, but Frank Easterbrook, a number of others argued that that we need clear standards about when to enforce. And Judge Bork, of course, put forward this idea that it all comes down to consumer welfare with a particular focus on price. But within this kind of body of thinking was this idea that mergers by and large are good, that bigger in general can often be better, which was a paradigm shift from what we had before. And what followed was that a lot of these ideas coming out of Chicago, coming out of Harvard, were enshrined in federal law through cases brought before the Supreme Court. And so what happened is that, enforcers started to have their hands tied by the precedents that were coming down from the courts, right? Even if they disagreed with the shift, even if they disagreed with what was coming out of Chicago and Harvard, they started having to deal with Supreme Court and Court of Appeals precedent that said the lodestar of antitrust is efficiency, and the lodestar of antitrust is consumer welfare, particularly price. And so, I think there are some that say, hey, enforcers, you were asleep at the wheel. And I think it's much more complicated than that. I think they had to deal with these precedents that were coming down from the courts that really circumscribed enforcers' ability to bring a lot of important cases. And so what Chair Khan, what Assistant Attorney General Cantor, and with a lot of terrific, state enforcers, Attorney General Miller, among others, Attorney General Racine here in DC, they're trying to resurrect. And what I'm trying to do with my team is return to the original understanding of the law. Look, I'm a former Hill staffer. For me, what Congress said and did is really important. But it's not just me, and you cannot look at that legislative history. You cannot listen to what Congress said and not come away with an understanding that the heart of antitrust is fairness rather than efficiency, and that antitrust emphatically is concerned with harms to small business. Yes, absolutely, it should be concerned with harms to consumers. Absolutely, yes, I care about price, I care about quality, I care about service, I care about what happens in the checkout line. But I also care about small businesses getting a fair shake. And so what we are trying to do as enforcers is swing the pendulum back to the original understanding of these laws.
You just kind of reminded me of one of what I found to be a really profound statement that you had in your editorial, that being that farmers have raised alarms about the consolidation of the input and product markets. Economists have answered that consolidation is unquestionably enhancing efficiency. When antitrust was guided by fairness, these farmers' families were part of a thriving middle class across rural America. After the shift to efficiency, their livelihoods began to disappear. It sounds like you have, seen rural America pretty personally. You talk about, Minnesota and rural Louisiana. Expand on your thoughts here of what you see, how consolidation is harming our rural communities.
So a lot of kind of the spirit of that statement came from a roundtable that we did in Des Moines. So the team convened a group of cattlemen and corn growers, and it was like 8 or 9 or 10 people. And I got to tell you, it was the most, I don't want to be too dramatic, but it was the most eye-opening, 60 to 90 minutes I've had as a commissioner, and I've been commissioner for about 6 months. And what they talked about, and every single person in that room was in a crisis in some way or another. And what they kept on coming back to was consolidation. They would talk about input markets, they would talk about product markets. It used to be there might be dozens of places, where they could buy seeds. It could be at least a handful of places they could get their cattle processed, meat packing plants they could take their cattle to. And now there are often 1 or 2 places for any particular input, and often one place they could take their cattle to be processed. And I remember this particular moment. This gentleman was there. His family had been in the seed business for generations. And he showed me a yellow kind of notepad with the names of 12 seed brands, seed companies they used to sell. and all but two of them were crossed out. Over the last several decades, one company had bought the other had gone on a business, and now his family sold two brands of seeds, and that was it. And it's no surprise, you don't need to be, an economist or a rocket scientist to understand what this does to farmers and cattlemen, right? If your input markets are being concentrated and the places where you can sell your product is being concentrated, what you're going to see is the input prices in general. Obviously, there's exceptions, but in general, you're going to see the input prices go up, and you're going to see the price for the products go down. And so it used to be that farmers would get 40 cents of every dollar spent at the grocery. Now they get 16 or 17 cents. And so they're going out of business by the thousands. There was this other a woman who attended the session who said, "Hey, look across Iowa. You got 850 or so main streets. 800 of them have been hollowed out by what's going on here. 800 of them are a shadow of what they used to be. And so this isn't just what's happening to farmers or cattlemen or corn growers. It's what's happening to their homes, to their communities, where the concentration is reducing their paycheck, but also the fruits of that is not invested in those communities anymore, right? It goes to some centralized company elsewhere. And the other thing that came up was, it wasn't just money, right? It wasn't just economy. It wasn't just jobs. Some of the most horrible stuff was, you'd have cattlemen, and these are, I don't need to tell you, these are tough people, right? These are people who have been through it all. Grown men and women saying through tears, what it's like to gas, the other thing, and you give me a lot of credit, I wish I spent more time in rural America. I'm not from rural America, but one thing that comes through in speaking to cattlemen in particular is how much they care about their cattle, their livestock. One cattleman talked about, and actually, no, this was someone who had referred a story to him and was so scared about it getting back to the meat packer that he had recorded an audio message on an encrypted messaging app. Wow. That he then shared with this other gentleman, and he encrypted it in audio so that it wasn't transcribed, right? So it couldn't just cut and paste. And then this other gentleman shared with us what this horrible story of this cow, and the thing that was really striking to me, and I want to have more conversations with cattlemen. This was one of the first, to be honest with you, how he talked about a specific cow that he knew, right? This cattleman is saying he'd had this cow for 8 years. He knew her, and she fell when she got to the processor, and she'd fallen in the truck and fell again on the outside. And what he was told is that they were just going to bolt her right there, and he'd still have to pay the rendering fee, but she'd be thrown in the garbage. They would just bolt her right then and there, and that's exactly what they did. And the way he told that story, you could tell that this was more than just a buck, right? This was more than just a paycheck. This was a creature who he was slaughtering to feed people, right? And that's why he did what he did. And so to see her treated this way, really, just took him aback. And there were these other stories about what was happening on the lot that would never have happened before. When there was competition, when you could say, okay, you treat my cattle this way, I'm going to take them somewhere else next time. Or you heard people talk about how what it's like to gas a warehouse full of cattle when you have overcrowding because the one meat packer you can take them to is shut down because of COVID. So it's not just economics, but it definitely is that. It's also just their day-to-day lives and the respect and dignity that they and their cattle are treated with. Yeah.
I should have asked this question earlier, but referring back to the FTC not having oversight over the meatpacking industry, tell us who does have the oversight power?
Sure. So a combination of USDA and DOJ, right? Okay. So standards and whatnot. My understanding is that's USDA's area, and the mergers mergers and acquisitions in the field would typically be DOJ. I'm sure there's been exceptions over the years, but the heart of that lives at the U.S. Department of Justice.
Okay, interesting. So the plague of corporate efficiency and consolidation has not only taken the legs out from farming and ranching, but it also is, we just talked about really done a number on our rural communities. So how are the remaining small businesses and rural communities expected to survive under this kind of corporate consolidation climate? What hope is there for them?
Yeah, and look, I'm a lawyer by trade and not a businessman, and so I don't have much practical advice, but I do have the perspective of someone who's been in enforcement for 6 months with a particular focus on this, and who has been very much focusing, our whole team's effort on this. And look, what I would say is this: you now have a whole of government approach that's trying to focus on antitrust in rural America and antitrust in agriculture in particular. That's the good news. And so you have, USDA issuing rules to prevent retaliation, when cattlemen complain about issues they see, on the lot, for example, making sure they are protected when they file those complaints. You have the FTC ramping up enforcement in areas like right to repair. I know that from Chair Khan and frankly from our Republican commissioners, they care a lot about antitrust in rural America. The pesticides case that was just voted out was I believe it was a unanimous vote. I forget whether my old colleague Commissioner Phillips had left before that case, but Commissioner Wilson voted for it. So you have a lot of attention, a lot of interest in this, but to be candid, it's going to take some time, right? It takes some time for these enforcement efforts to ramp up. And so the other thing I would do, and this comes across in the RCAF messages, particularly from your CEO, is make sure to tell your story to enforcers like me, to your elected officials in your state capital and your elected officials in DC. I'll tell you, you can read about it on the page. There's nothing quite like sitting in a room full of cattlemen and corn growers who are saying, it's like we're standing on an ice cube. We got a noose around our necks, or it's like being pecked to death by a chicken, and to see just how much they are hurting. And so I would say, hang in there. Yes, there are folks in DC and your state capital who are trying to ramp up enforcement. There's also, I think, $15 million in federal dollars that's going to let state attorneys general hire staff targeted at these issues. But in the meantime, do anything you can to reach out to folks like me. And I'll say, one thing I saw as a Hill staffer is a lot of times you have rural communities reaching out to their representatives, and that's good. But I would say, to the degree you can, try to visit the folks from other places who aren't familiar with these stories, because it's hard to walk out of a room, like the one that we had in Des Moines, and not care about this at a visceral level. And so that's what I would say. It's tough going, but my hope is that there's help on the way, and that with every passing year that we're able to keep up this enforcement, that things will get better slowly.
Why should every listener, including consumers, be zoned into this topic?
Yeah. So I'll tell you a couple practical reasons, and then one big picture reason. But one of the things you learn when you learn about what's happening to cattlemen is that the price you're paying for beef at the grocery store, and that higher price tag does not translate into higher, more money for cattlemen. I'll share a story I've shared with my team. So I like to grill in the winter because I like to feel alive, and it's this little cheat. You feel like you're somehow sneaking in something fun you do in the summer and the winter, and so my wife typically buys her groceries, and so I said, I'll get some steaks. We're going to grill some steaks this weekend, and so she's like, oh, I got a really good price on these ribeyes, and they showed up. And it was like a regular ribeye, but it had been cut horizontally so that it was like 1.5 centimeters thick. And we paid basically regular price for ribeye for what's a half a ribeye. and it was one of these moments where, look, even if it's just ground beef, you're paying more and more at the checkout line. But people need to know that it's not like cattlemen are becoming fat cats off of that. It's the opposite, right? They are seeing less and less for their product. It's the, a lot of them allege it's the folks in the middle, right? And so it's the same problem. The same problem of higher prices at the checkout line is the problem that cattlemen are facing of lower prices when they sell their product at the lot. So that's the first practical reason. The other reason is, look, when you're talking about, if you have a family, if you have kids, if you're around little kids, everyone knows this. There's a lot of products that can wait, right? I don't need to get my kids, these chips or this juice. But if I run low on milk, I got to fix that straight away, right? If we don't have beef or meat for them to eat, that's a problem, right? We have to fix that straight away so they get their protein. And so, look, obviously, I believe in a free market. I think that we win when there's a strong free market, free competition, but it's not just about dollars and cents. We as Americans have an interest in having cattlemen and having dairy farmers who are here in the United States, such that when the next COVID comes, God forbid, the next crisis comes of that scale, not just young parents, but everyone else still has access to milk and beef and meat. And so I think there's, some call it national security, some call it, a health issue, but, anything that is driving cattlemen and other farmers out of business by the thousands is something that you should care about, not just because of the price tag you pay at the checkout line, but also in terms of making sure your family has what it needs at the grocery store. And then lastly, Max, who I mentioned, has a line kind of about the principles at play here. And so, we owe a particular debt to farmers for our antitrust laws. And so he wrote a couple of years ago something that has really stuck with me, which is, if antitrust is failing farmers, antitrust is simply failing, full stop. And so this isn't just any old industry. This is an industry that we to whom we owe, to which we owe our antitrust laws for it. So if those folks are suffering, if those folks are going out of business by the thousand, it's not just one industry becoming more efficient. It's a crisis. And so just as a matter of principle, on top of practical reasons of what happens at your grocery store, I think we need to care.
That is excellent. Great reminder.
Yeah, that was fantastic. Great explanation. Preaching to the choir. Yes. So now what? What do we do to fight back against this consolidation and return healthy competition back to America for the best interests of consumers and our communities?
Yeah. So I don't mean to be repetitive, but here are the top lines for me, and then I'll hone in a little bit as to what our team is doing specifically and how we're spending our time. Look, again, I agree with the president on some things, I disagree with him on some things, but President Biden has said, we are following a whole of government approach, and Chair Khan, our chair, has said that we want to be a part of that approach. We're an independent commission. She could have said, well, that's nice, but not doing that. But no, I mean, she has said that we're going to be part of this effort. And so it's not just the FTC, it's also USDA and DOJ who are thinking hard about how to help. But as for us, here's what we're doing. First of all, right to repair is a top priority. Three cases. I mentioned Weber. I mentioned Harley Davidson. There's also a case, Westinghouse energy generators, which are really important in rural areas as well, where the commission is going out of its way to make sure that folks have the ability to repair their products without incurring even greater expenses. And again, I would say that for folks listening who have a story to tell about their farm equipment, their ranch equipment, where they encountered this, please share that information with the FTC. Go to ftc.gov. There's a number of ways you can report this. But And also you can reach out to me and my team. I'll just say, I'm A Bedoya at ftc.gov. A Bedoya, B like boy, E, D like dog, OYA at ftc.gov. I would like to hear from you directly about this stuff. So that's right to repair. Second, we are trying to learn everything possible about input markets. We were thrilled that the FTC staff, the ACP team, the anti-competitive practices team, put a terrific team on this. And for years worked this pesticides case. And they have heard from the top, from Democrats and Republicans, yes, please, we need more of these cases. This is exactly the kind of case we should be bringing, because those inputs have so many downstream effects, not just on the corn growers, not just on the cattlemen, but the whole all the way down to the consumer and the public. And so you need to know that when I meet with these shops, I say, okay, what are we doing, in healthcare? What are we doing in food supply? And what are we doing to help folks in rural and urban America? And that's another conversation for another day. What's happening in urban America, although it's very similar to what's happening in rural America. I'd actually love to talk with you about that offline or in another setting, because there's a lot of overlap. Lastly, the retail sector, right? So we have this law passed in 1936, the Robinson-Patman Act, that we need to be better about trying to enforce, to make sure that your independent grocer, has a shot at competing on the merits. Right? There's a line out there about Robinson-Patman that it eliminates quantity discounts. That is not what it does. What it does is offer, the independent retailer, the independent grocer, the opportunity to get the same terms when often they can meet those quantity discounts or other factors apply. But we want to reinvigorate that law. And that law, by the way, isn't just about secret discounts. It's also about secret rebates and making sure that if someone is acting as your broker, they're not getting kickbacks from the other party, which there are a lot of allegations about kickbacks in a number of different industries in a lot of the spaces we've talked about. But lastly, I can tell you what my team and I are doing. One thing I'm really proud of is, it may sound silly, but when you become a commissioner, you get all these invitations to conferences, and the last one, was in Switzerland, and sure, I'd like to go to Switzerland. That'd be nice. But that's not what we're trying to prioritize here. I'm really proud that, the first 3 trips we've taken are respectively to West Virginia, to Des Moines, and to Minneapolis. And the next big trip we're taking is to Pine Ridge in South Dakota. What we are really trying to do is prioritize, and the other thing about those conferences is you get this opportunity to speak as if you're this oracle of knowing everything, and here are my interesting thoughts about X and Y and Z. And most of the folks in the audience, and look, in fairness, I am one of those folks, right? I'm one of the folks who sits in those kinds of audiences. So no disrespect to these people, but most of them are either lawyers or enforcers or regulators or lobbyists. And so we're trying to do the opposite, right? We're trying to spend our time in rural America and elsewhere in the country, where we are listening to people and hearing their stories about what they're experiencing, and looking for ways to help. So that's what we are trying to do. And so I do have 2 toddlers at home, and so I can't, I'm not too popular when I spend too much time on the road, but when I can take these windows, that's what we're trying to prioritize. And sure, I'm going to speak at some conferences just like everyone else, but that's how we're trying to spend our time, listening to the folks who are living this stuff every single day.
Well, Commissioner Bedoya, this has been a very enlightening and very interesting conversation. So do you have any other final comments you want to add?
I don't. I'm just excited about the last question, which, but we don't have to get to that yet.
Okay, well, we're here. We're to it. So around here, we love beef. That's no secret. So last question we always like to finish with, and I know you're excited to answer, is what is your favorite cut of beef and how do you like it prepared?
So it's kind of both a comment and a question. So when I was not a dad, I was taught to cook steak by a guy from Bolivia, who comes from rural Bolivia. And so what he taught me, and I was probably 20 years old or something. He taught me, there's this thing they do where they take rosemary and garlic and they chop it up really fine and they actually insert it in the steak. And then I told my mom, I was like, oh, I learned to cook steak this way. And she said, oh, bistec a lo macho, which basically means manly steak. I don't know, is there, have you heard of this? Because anytime, yeah, is that a thing? So tell me about that.
I've just heard about it in that culture. I wouldn't say it's like a Midwestern thing.
So that's what I'm asking.
I've never heard of that.
Okay. It's really good. Now you lose some of the juiciness, but it's really, really good. But now that I'm with that, it's just a little bit of oil, salt, and pepper. You don't have much time to chop all that stuff up. So yeah, medium rare ribeye with some oil, some salt, and some pepper, maybe some garlic powder, and maybe a little butter if we're feeling rich. But that's it.
That sounds good to us. That is always a good answer. Ribeye is always a safe answer. Thank you so much for being on with us today. And thank you for all the work you do. We appreciate it.
And let me say one thing. The next time you come to DC, please come visit at the commission. Would love to have a cup of coffee with you and to meet your folks. So just reach out to Max, reach out to Catherine, and we'll set it up.
We are so thankful to Commissioner Bedoya for joining us and for having such a fantastic conversation with us and for sharing his insights and experiences. We are also thankful to him and his team for paying special attention to this topic and for all the work they are putting in to benefit American consumers, cattle producers, and our rural communities. So thanks for tuning in today. As always, stay involved in the conversation and follow us at RCAF USA on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the RCAF USA Roundup. To learn more about RCAF USA, visit our website, www.r-cafusa.com.